The structure of the United States Army has seen some change since its inception in 1776. However, for the most part, it has remained relatively unchanged. During the First World War, the American Expeditionary Forces were commanded by General John J. Pershing, which was mobilized in June 1917. However, the first American unit under American command didn't see combat until October 21, 1917, when the 1st Division fired the first American shell against the Germans in the Luneville sector near Nancy, France. After the 1st Division sent a battalion from each regiment and had designated its artillery batteries, the 1st Division were then ordered to move abreast the French 18th Division. For those unfamiliar or out of practice with how the American Army is structured, the previous statements can be confusing. After all, what is the difference between a division and a regiment? To understand this, we must look at how an army is formed by thinking of it as a pyramid of sorts. During the First World War, the American Expeditionary Forces saw the formation of the American 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Armies. They are better known as field armies. Each field army consisted of at least 2 corps, which are the next step down in the command and organizational structure. In World War I, there were various types of corps that served under the field armies within the American Expeditionary Forces. The Ambulance Corps was known by different names and primarily provided medical services and transportation to the wounded. The Corps was composed of active duty and volunteer personnel, whereby some sections consisted of minorities and women. The Army Corps, probably the most well-known of all, consisted of infantry and other combat units that were primarily responsible for the offensive and defensive operations conducted throughout the war. There were 9 corps in total, each labeled with a Roman numeral to distinguish themselves from one another. The Coast Artillery Corps provided nearly all railway and heavy artillery operations, as well as anti-aircraft defense and controlled minefield operations against enemy ships and undersea boats, better known as U-boats. The Signal Corps had 4 primary corps within itself, all with the primary task of gathering and managing information collected for the command and control of the combat forces, including any military intelligence, photographs, weather reports, and communications needed to effectively plan and commence military operations, with the U.S. Army Air Corps eventually becoming the U.S. Air Force. The Tank Corps was responsible for the mechanized warfare on the front. Although the U.S. never produced any tanks of her own design during the war, a vast number of British heavy Mark V and French Renault FT-17s were borrowed to make up the Corps, as well as the M1917, which was produced in the U.S. but borrowed from the Renault's design. Each corps commanded a series of divisions, with at least 2 divisions per corps. There were a total of 64 active American divisions organized in the Great War, whether partially or in whole. All were infantry divisions excluding the 15th Cavalry Division. Each division commanded at least 2 brigades, which sometimes varied in designations and tasks. The most common type of brigade was the infantry brigade. However, depending on how the division was organized, it could also have a designated cavalry, divisional troops, field artillery, or depot brigades. Nonetheless, the division was composed of brigades, and brigades were composed of regiments and/or battalions. During World War I, the U.S. Army Brigade was commonly composed of at least 2 regiments or battalions. A battalion or regiment was often designated by its dedicated mode of operation. For example, an infantry brigade commonly had 2 infantry regiments and 1 machine gun battalion. Divisional troops were a brigade that held signal battalions, headquarters troops, and trains. Meanwhile, field artillery brigades would hold around 3 field artillery regiments and 1 trench mortar regiment. However, there were differences between battalions and regiments. Regiments would have battalions and companies under their command, whereas battalions would only have companies under their command, but didn't always serve directly under a regiment. Take for another example an infantry regiment, which would often have battalions within them to help organize and command the companies that operated within them, such as a 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Battalion. Meanwhile, a more specialized battalion, such as a machine gun battalion, would operate under the command of the brigade and not a regiment unless told otherwise. Regardless, the next level under the command from a regiment and/or battalion was the company. A company would most often be labeled in an alphabetical order and correspond to the battalion of which they belonged to. For example, a 1st Battalion would often be composed of companies A, B, C, and D. 2nd Battalion would be composed of companies E, F, G, and H, and so on. Again, these designations were dependent on the parameters of the regiment or battalion in which they fell, and the alphanumeric designations were not always the case for a company, such as the case of, say, a machine gun company. Regardless, companies were composed of platoons, and then they're further broken down into smaller groups such as firing squads and patrols. And there you have it, the command structure of the U.S. Army during the First World War. On behalf of the George S. Robb Center for the Study of the Great War, we thank you for your continued support. My name is Joshua Weston, signing out.